Well, good morning, everybody. Great to have you all here. I really appreciate you all joining us this morning for this webinar on our microplastics work to date and to work together to move it forward. We're always excited about the participation of everyone in this event and how we're moving it forward into actual sampling. The policy and definitions were a bunch of work, and the method development as well, and we certainly appreciate everyone's effort on that part, and now advancing this into trying to get some good sampling data, and the approach will be real important for everyone as we continue to work in this space of microplastics, which is certainly continues to be a topic of the moment and concern, and continuing to develop information about it. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Scott Coffin to carry us forward, and look forward to everyone's participation. Thank you so much. Take it away, Scott.
Thank you for the introduction, Darren, and thank you everyone for attending this meeting. Looks like we have 100 attendees online. So let me get slides pulled up for everyone. Alrighty, so today we are going to be talking about all the details for implementing the policy handbook for microplastics in drinking water, and also be setting forth some expectations and guidelines for water systems to work with the Division of Drinking Water to select sampling locations for the upcoming monitoring orders that are going to be sent out later this year. So we've got a pretty packed agenda. I'm going to start with a pretty high level, but also in-depth overview of the Division of Drinking Water's plans for monitoring microplastics. And this, for a lot of people that have seen some recent webinars or attended the board workshop for the policy handbook back in September, a lot of this is going to be a repeat, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page going forward. So I'm going to be covering really all of the science that got us to where we are for the decision making for the Division of Drinking Water as planned, and then I'll be ending with how we are implementing this plan and what you all should be understanding for your expectations, or sorry, our expectations for you at the end of this webinar. So as we all know, plastic is everywhere. Seems like everywhere from the deepest part of the ocean to the tallest mountain, we found it. And this is not going to go away anytime soon. It seems to be increasing exponentially with business as usual. And the issue is that the plastic doesn't just degrade or biodegrade, it rather fragments into smaller and smaller particles. We know this as microplastics. And when you zoom in on one of these small particles and look at the surface of one of those particles, you can see more and more smaller particles, in this case, nano size, forming. And so it's easy to visualize with this how the plastic pollution problem quickly becomes a micro scale and nanoscale problem that could potentially affect our health. And this is really what brought California's legislature to pass a foundational bill that we'll be talking about today. I do want to nod to a very similar bill, just so that we're all aware. Senate Bill 1263 was passed in 2018, which requires that the Ocean Protection Council and the state water boards initiate a statewide microplastic strategy by 2022. That document is available online and sets forth all of the plans for the below box. So developing a risk assessment framework, standardized methods, getting baseline occurrence data, investigating sources and pathways, and then recommending source reduction strategies back to the legislature. I'm mentioning that just so that you all have an idea of that we're not just working on drinking water siloed. We are really thinking broadly about addressing microplastics through multiple different avenues and for multiple different mandates. The same year that Senate Bill 1263 was passed, they also passed Senate Bill 1422, which was based off of the first finding of microplastics in tap water, finding 94% of samples in the United States contained some level of microplastics. And Senate Bill 1422, as we all, or most of us know by now, required the definition and a plan for 4 years of monitoring. And with that plan, we needed to adopt a standardized analytical method, provide accreditation for it, and then consider the health effects and how to communicate that to consumers. So defining microplastics is not a trivial task. This is really one of the most broad contaminant suites that the State Water Board has ever worked with, and potentially any regulatory agency. And in order to be health protective, we adopted a rather broad definition, intentionally broad, to be more inclusive of particles than potentially exclude particles that we may or may not know if they're there or if they're harmful. So in short, this is particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters, and they can have chemical additives or not. We do provide exclusions for truly natural occurring polymers that haven't been chemically modified. So, of course, this is all of the plastics that have those chasing arrows on the bottom. This is a relatively small number of plastics that are actually in production, about 30 or so. But when you start thinking about all of the other plastics that this includes, there's a lot of novel materials, as well as proprietary formulations, copolymers often found in synthetic rubber for tires, fibers, new silicones, which sometimes are labeled as plastic-free, but they are plastic under the California definition, bio-based and biodegradable polymers, and cellulose acetate, which is one of the most commonly found forms of plastic in the environment. So now that we understand what we consider to be microplastics, we can do some foundational science to figure out what is the level of concern that we should have to protect human health. So we conducted a human and ecological health effects workshop to evaluate the literature with experts from around the world. And we charged them with understanding or developing a framework to evaluate the health effects of microplastics, considering what doses are relevant, what particle characteristics drive toxicity, and what those adverse effects are. So, as a lot of us already know, risk is defined by toxicologists a little bit differently than it is by the layperson. Toxicologists define risk as the probability to cause harm, and it really is a combination of the hazard and the exposure. When something is more hazardous, then it's higher likelihood of risk with the same exposure, and vice versa. With microplastics, we're dealing with an extremely diverse contaminant suite that can present hazards through the chemicals that are added to the particles, the pathogens that can adhere to these particles, and the particles themselves. And when it comes to the chemicals, we know that there are many different additives, estimate of at least 10,000, and 2,400 of these are considered substances of concern for human health and ecological impacts. Unfortunately, not all of these are regulated, so a lot of these are still occurring in plastics, and a lot of them are being, some of the chemicals that are being phased out that are problematic are being replaced by very similar chemicals, such as bisphenol A, being replaced with bisphenol S. And we don't have information on all of these chemicals either. When it comes to the plastic as a carrier for pathogens, this is where we know very little. But what recent reports have come out indicate that plastics act as a relatively stable substrate for pathogenic viruses and bacteria. Giardia toxoplasmosa and Cryptosporidia was found and adhered to plastics at higher concentrations than other types of particles naturally occurring. And there's also some research indicating that when plastics go through a wastewater treatment plant, they may act as a stable substrate for some pathogens and could also enrich antibiotic-resistant bacteria. When it comes to the particle-based hazards, we actually have quite a bit of information for the ecological impacts and some emerging evidence for the human health impacts. We know back from 1960, the first ever study looking at plastic particles with relevance to human health, that these particles can be taken up into the intestines and distributed through organs. It wasn't for another 40 years or so until there was another meaningful study published on the impacts of microplastics for humans. And really the vast majority of the literature has emerged after 2019. And so we conducted a systematic review. We found 29 ingestion-based in vivo mammalian microplastics toxicity studies and screened these for reliability and relevance for risk assessment to determine if we can derive a meaningful health-based threshold, or at least an understanding of what the health effects are, to support Senate Bill 1422. So of these studies, we deemed that only 12 were fit for purpose for further evaluation, which then underwent scrutinous review by experts in the physiological fields of interest. So looking at all of those studies, we found that the reliable information that we have is mostly for male reproductive impacts and female reproductive impacts. You can see here the number of studies that are color-coded by the type of impact and the specific endpoints that were measured that had reliable data. And so with this, we took a big step back and said, well, it seems like there could be something happening with male reproduction, at least in rodents, with some of these particles. But how do we extrapolate this to humans, especially considering this broad contaminant suite, different shapes, sizes that we're exposed to? We looked at the effect mechanisms, and while we've commonly observed some, like reactive oxygen species formation, oxidative stress, and inflammation, we don't have enough information right now to extrapolate those concentrations to humans. We also understood from this review that we are really only concerned about the microplastics that are smaller than 10 micrometers when it comes to human health, as these are the particles that can accumulate in tissues. Particles larger than that, they typically are excreted rapidly by the human body. Dose response assessment using EPA's benchmark dose modeling software, just to get a rough idea of where we're seeing effects and if there is a large range across different sizes and shapes and studies. And we found, to our surprise, actually relatively conserved range, just 3 orders of magnitude between the different toxicological endpoints, with large ranges of sizes of particles. So relating those concentrations to exposure will get us closer to an estimation of risk. We know that humans are exposed to microplastics, and by some biomonitoring studies looking at lungs, blood, placenta, and breast milk. And we've also been able to estimate daily and annual exposures based on consumption of different media. Very wide uncertainties and variabilities associated with this assessment. But you can see here when you overlay the benchmark dose range of the hazards for the particles from those reliable studies with the total exposure, there is some overlap with the interquartile range. There are very high uncertainties with this assessment, but this does suggest for a risk assessor that we cannot completely close the book on microplastics and say that it's a non-issue. We need to proceed with caution and get some more data here before making any firm conclusions. So we determined that it's currently not possible to derive regulatory levels for microplastics in drinking water because the effects database is inadequate. There are uncertain effect mechanisms which are necessary to extrapolate to the diversity of plastics that we're exposed to. And there's incomplete exposure data, which the state can actually fill that data gap by collecting harmonized drinking water data and potentially food data as well. So based on all of this, in lieu of deriving a number to be a notification level or response level, we developed recommended language to be included in an annual consumer confidence report to be sent alongside the microplastics monitoring data to consumers. This language is really a starting place, and you'll hear from a later presenter how we're working with water systems to get this messaging really as useful as it can be for water systems and build a toolkit. So briefly, studies of rodents exposed to some types of microplastics through drinking water indicate potentially adverse effects, including on the reproductive system. However, more research is needed to understand potential human health implications and at what concentrations adverse effects may occur. Therefore, California is monitoring microplastics in drinking water to understand its occurrence and is supporting ongoing research. We also know that this field is rapidly increasing with studies being published at an exponential rate for the human health impacts of microplastics. So we anticipate that soon we'll be able to reevaluate the literature to determine if there is enough information to derive a health-based numeric threshold. And what's shown here is a living database, an R-Shiny application that our group built based on our critical review that allows researchers to upload toxicity data from published studies, allowing for this meta-analysis that we conducted to be done in real time. This is an open source app called Tomex app that is usable by just about anyone. So give that a look if you haven't already. And now I'm going to go on to another critical component for Senate Bill 1422, which is the analysis methods. We conducted an interlaboratory validation study using FTIR and Raman spectroscopy and 26 laboratories from 7 different countries. We not only did this for drinking water, but we're also wrapping this up for more complicated matrices, including ocean water, fish tissue, and sediment. The goal of the study was to determine the recovery and bias of the instruments, but also understand what processes could be prone to contamination, how long it takes to run these studies, how expensive it is. And in order to do this, we needed to send blind samples to these studies and have them record information. Upon receiving the blind sample, they would extract it in a vacuum manifold, as shown here, identify the particles and categorize them, take pictures and measurements, and then send them off to chemical analysis using FTIR or Raman. Some labs chose to use pyrolysis GCMS as well. And the blind samples that we sent, this was really a single project that was done by our collaborators in Norway. Unfortunately, there are no commercial distributors of these sort of blind samples, something we're looking for, but these samples contain 4 different polymers, 4 different size fractions, and 4 different shapes. We also threw in some false positives. So this really allows us to understand the influence of these different factors on the recovery and bias of labs. So looking overall at the method performance, notice the log scale on the y-axis here with recovery. We had a median of about 30% recovery for all particles for all laboratories. But this really isn't the full story, as we did see some pretty significant biases with different sizes of particles in particular, with very few labs attempting the small size fraction from 1 to 20 microns and having very wide variability in terms of recovery. For the larger size fractions, we did see much better recovery and closer to the 100% mark with lower variability, but we did observe some biases with different colors as well as different morphologies, suggesting potential self-contamination from analysts, as well as lack of recovery for certain particles. We also determined that experience really matters across the board, with novice laboratories having more contamination than the intermediate and expert laboratories, as well as lower precision. For the study, again, we not only wanted to collect the information about the accuracy and bias of these methods, but we also needed to understand how much they cost and how long they take. We determined that if you're just using an optical microscope, you have got about a 50-50 chance of classifying a particle as plastic or not, because you're really just taking a human-based guess. We really need to have a chemical confirmation with infrared or Raman spectroscopy, which is highly accurate. However, these instruments come with additional cost, with the Raman being more expensive than the infrared, but also the Raman gets you to theoretically smaller particles than the infrared. We do anticipate these costs to come down as instrument manufacturers come on the market, introducing more advanced instruments that can be capable of automation and really getting the measurement time per sample lower. recognizing that a lot of laboratories probably will not have a fully automated or a device, or even if they do have a device capable of automation, they may not want to analyze every particle on the sample. So we determined that in order to get a low enough relative standard deviation for surface water, at least, that you need to analyze 3 sets of greater than or equal to 30 particles per sample. This is what we included in the subsampling component of the protocol and in the published method. So this is really a way of getting laboratories to reduce that cost through the time that it takes to run these samples. Excuse me, the standard operating protocols, or sorry, the methods for microplastics monitoring that we developed are available on the State Water Board website. Notice that we have already revised these since the initial methods, and we have 2 versions. One is for infrared and one is for Raman spectroscopy. We are also providing accreditation for these methods through the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, or ELAP. We don't have any laboratories that have been accredited yet, but we do have one that is quite close, which is shown here at the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research. We are also working with NIST to update the positive control samples and develop a proficiency testing sample so that we can evaluate laboratory performance quantitatively. Currently, what's available from NIST and Hawaii Pacific University is the Polymer Kit 1.0, which can be used by laboratories to make sure that their Raman and infrared is providing accurate information. We are developing, again, a proficiency testing sample with NIST. Eventually, this will be something representative of the particles found in drinking water. It'll be a complex mixture of plastics that we can then use to evaluate laboratory performance. But this is not available yet, unfortunately. We also realized that we don't necessarily need to use a Raman and infrared method for every sample. Potentially, in the future, this could be done for source waters for drinking water, or for treated water, or for other matrices outside of the drinking water world. We could have what's called a tiered monitoring framework, where we use some sort of screening method that is inexpensive and quick and provides enough information to know if you may have an issue or not, before going to more advanced, more expensive methods like pyrolysis GCMS, where you're just getting mass, or Raman and FTIR, where you're getting that detailed characterization for each individual particle. We're also supporting emerging methods. We want to get down to the smaller size range. As I mentioned earlier, we really only care about those 10 microns and smaller particles for human health. So in order to get at these particles, we're going to need to invest in emerging technologies that can get to these smaller and smaller particles. So that's a good overview of the science that to get us to where we have the methods and the particles that we're looking for human health. And in order to turn that into policy, we need to understand a little bit about where the plastics are coming from, where we may find them in the state, and how they're being treated or not before they're being delivered to drinking, before the drinking water is being delivered to consumers. So there's not a great or perfect overview out there of which plastics are more abundant in the environment than others, because it really is context and location dependent. But this is sort of a top 6, typically appearing in this order, where you're finding fragments from food packaging, fibers from clothing and other textiles, tire wear particles, paint chips, cigarette filters, and personal care products like intentionally added microbeads. This is a general sort of relative contribution that we see in the environment. And when it comes to single-use plastic packaging, there's really only a few polymers that we find. The vast majority is made from polyethylene, polyethylene terephthalate, or polypropylene, with smaller amounts of polystyrene, PVC, polyurethane, and other. When it comes to microfibers, we also see a dominance of just one polymer, polyester, with a couple other fiber types that are also found. And these are more and more being sent to terrestrial environments as well as water bodies, but the fraction going to terrestrial environments seems to be increasing. The reason for this is that a lot of the fibers that get shed from our clothing in washing machines end up in land environments through the application of biosolids. A recent study estimated 2.2 kilotons of synthetic microfibers were generated by apparel washing in California in 2019, of which 74% entered terrestrial environments through the application of biosolids. We also are learning that the rubber fragments that come from our tires may be a significant source of microplastics in our waterways, as a study from San Francisco Bay found these particles fairly ubiquitously. We're also, I mentioned earlier, cigarette butts have cellulose, are made of cellulose acetate. This is one of the most commonly found microplastics in the environment, and cigarette butts themselves are the #1 litter item that are found in California's beaches by a long shot. So when it comes to the occurrence, so that was the sources. So where are they actually occurring in the environment? Are they in surface waters? Are they in groundwater? Does the proximity to roads or farms make a difference? While we don't have the full knowledge for this or complete answers, what we do know is that these plastic particles are really moving through the biosphere at very high rates through air and wind, as well as being washed out through water, stormwater. So for instance, this 2D diagram, you can see the cars that are shedding microplastics that are being washed into the waterway from stormwater. Single-use plastics can make their way into the environment, fragments, become buried and resuspended. Some of these particles are eventually going to make it into a drinking water treatment plant, and they may or may not be removed fully before they're sent to consumers. And of course, wastewater treatment plants are going to be discharging some amount as well. We know from a recent study in San Francisco Bay that stormwater is a very significant pathway for microplastics to enter waterways, as this study found that it contributed 300 times more microplastics into the bay cumulatively than wastewater. And it was dominated by, again, these black rubbery fragments, which were thought to be tire wear particles. We also know that microplastics can undergo long-range aerial transport. These are typically the very, very small particles that are carried up as dust, and they can travel many kilometers. And the reason that we are concerned about this for drinking water is that a lot of the pristine sources in California tend to be in remote alpine settings, such as Lake Tahoe. And in these cases, the sources are, we can't be sure that they're completely free of microplastics, as even in remote locations in the Swiss Alps, they've found concentrations of microplastics in the snow up there. When it comes to groundwater, here we have some good news. There's been only a few studies, but they've all found very, very low concentrations, between 0 and 0.007 microplastics per liter. This is much lower than what we typically find in surface water. The reason for this is that most groundwater or most ground particles tend to act as a natural filter for microplastics, preventing them from getting into the actual groundwater. We don't have, again, all of the answers on this, and so we want to confirm that this is actually happening to the extent that we believe it is. But current indication is that groundwater likely not contaminated by microplastics at a significant quantity. The distribution system, again, we don't know everything, but what we do know is from a couple studies is that it doesn't seem to be a significant source of microplastics. This, again, is probably going to be dependent on the type of pipes and really the temperature that these pipes are being subjected to. In this particular study, they compared a new pipeline and an old pipeline that were made of, I think, PEX, and they didn't find any difference in the plastic particles that were making it to the sampling point. When it comes to pipes inside someone's home, I would be concerned about the pipes that carry the hot water, especially if it's near boiling temperature. This is where I would suspect some shedding from those pipes, but with cold water, probably very limited shedding. When it comes to treatment, there are, again, not full answers, but what we do know is that microplastics are removed incidentally by the majority of surface water treatment plant treatment processes. So, everything from 99.4% has been found in the literature with a membrane filter down to 50% for catalytic degradation. And so really, any type of membrane filter or size-based exclusion treatment process is going to remove a vast majority of microplastics, and other types of filters like rapid sand filtration is going to remove a significant amount as well. It will be size dependent though, and this is really a challenging thing to evaluate in the literature as well as to communicate to consumers that, in this particular study, 90% of the microplastics were removed, but the remaining fraction was the smallest fraction that we care about for the human health. So you can see that all the particles that are larger than 100 microns and even 50 microns were removed just by sedimentation and filtration. But the small particles that remained, again, are the ones that are not only problematic for human health, but difficult to monitor with current analytical methods. Consumers may also wonder, should I be using a filter? If so, what type of filter? Here, we almost know nothing. I've only been able to find a master's thesis on this particular topic, and they found using a Brita filter, there was some removal of microplastics. Unfortunately, we don't have a test standard for this, although I know that NSF ANSI is developing a sort of surrogate using non-plastic particles that could be reliable for looking at particle filtration and potentially microplastics. For developing all of this science and information into a monitoring plan, this was adopted in September of last year, and this sets forth really the 4-year plan that we have for laboratories as well as water systems. And like I mentioned before, treatment, really a huge factor here. It's size dependent, and when you compare it to our Raman and FTIR methods, the majority of treatment plants that use surface water as a source water are going to be incidentally removing the microplastics that we can detect with our instrumentation, as many systems in the state use flocculation and sedimentation. So this is quite problematic for developing a monitoring program, as we want to be able to look at the particles that people are being exposed to, but if we were to look in treated drinking water, it's unlikely that we would actually be able to detect the particles that are making it through this process, those small particles. Luckily for us, we know that microplastics behave in relatively conserved manners in freshwaters across the globe due to a large number of studies that have looked at these particle size distributions. And if we have a good idea for the size distribution, you can interpolate the missing portion or the portion that you can't see based off of the measured portion, just like you could do that with an iceberg if you understood the shape of the iceberg. So based on all of this information, we developed a sampling and analysis plan with the overall goal of characterizing source contamination for the largest population served by drinking water in the state with the fewest samples possible. And we split this up into 2 phases. Phase 1 involves sampling the source waters upstream in distribution. So we're not going to be sampling the treated drinking waters in phase 1, just the source waters. And we want to get these, we ideally want to be sampling at the last location before it enters a treatment plant. This will be 2 years of quarterly monitoring for those particular locations. And the majority of the monitoring is going to be in surface water sources, because again, this is where we believe to be the most contaminated. We'll be prioritizing systems that have theoretically lower treatment capabilities, but still including some systems that we know are going to treat the majority of the particles using membrane filters. After this study, we'll be evaluating the need for additional sampling after phase 1. This is the broad scope of the monitoring plan. After phase 1, we'll be evaluating additional steps. We may add systems, we may remove systems, we may implement a tiered monitoring framework. And currently we're what I'm calling the pilot phase, where we're still developing some things to help implement this program, including a sampling method comparison, which you'll hear about later today, range finding to understand concentrations found in California's source waters, and then training sampling analysts. In order to determine the list of systems that could potentially be receiving monitoring orders, we split up the treatment processes by 3 generic categories: high removal, medium removal, and low removal. Again, we didn't want to get ultra quantitative with this because the literature is just not at a level of certainty that one can do that, so we decided to bin them accordingly. Just looking at the drinking water treatment plants in California, we see that when it comes to surface water, the vast majority of plants are using some type of filtration that's removing a decent amount of particles, medium or medium filtration. However, there's still quite a few plants that have effectively no filtration at all. For groundwater, we see very few systems that provide any sort of filtration for particles, as again, it's probably not necessary for them to do that as the ground is acting as that filter. So bringing together all of this information, this is the sampling matrix for systems included in phase 1 of monitoring. So you can see here filtration on the y-axis and the type of water source on the x-axis. So we only are requiring 3 groundwater sources or primary groundwater sources to monitor, 2 groundwater under direct influence of surface water, and then the remaining are surface water treatment plants. Sorry, they use surface water as their source water, and the majority of them have medium or low treatment. We also strive to get geographic diversity for the sampling plan. So you can see here, while the majority of the plants are located in high population regions of the state, we also did get some lower population regions to get that geographical diversity. If you want to see an interactive map that you can look at all the details of these systems and a little more easy, you can type in bit.ly/California system map, and I can drop that link into the chat as well. So that brings me to the Division of Drinking Water's expectations for water systems that are listed in Appendix A. So on that map or in Appendix A of the Sampling Analysis Handbook, we want to work with systems to determine where we really should be monitoring. And no one knows the systems better than the systems themselves, system operators. And so we'd like you to submit a letter to the Division of Drinking Water identifying the preferred sampling locations. The letter should include a rationale for why those particular locations and a map. It doesn't need to be a super in-depth map. It can be really just a schematic of the different relevant components of the system. You can submit this as a single system, or you can also submit this as a group, as a way of consolidating monitoring. Many systems share sources of water, in which case it would make sense to do this in a consolidated fashion. The deadline for submitting this letter is July 7th, and DDW will return the letters by August 25th. Please send the letter to the email address shown here, ddwregunit@waterboards.ca.gov, and I'll also be providing that in the chat and sending the slides out after this webinar. This doesn't need to be a long letter. This can be just a couple pages and have a relatively simple map, something like this, where you would identify the major components that we'd want to know for your system. What are your major water sources, whether it be a reservoir or a river, and how does that water get to the treatment plant? Is it a closed pipeline? Is it an open canal? Are there any major roads that could potentially shed plastics into an open canal, for example? Or another potentially significant source is farmland or industry or landfills. Just being sure to identify those potentially relevant sources of plastic particles into the surface water in particular. And so in this particular case, looking at this theoretical schematic, I would likely want to monitor right before treatment plant B, as here we're seeing it's gone through an open canal that has gone by a road and some farm, likely received a lot of plastics runoff from those sources. And we want to understand the contamination before it gets treated at the treatment plant B. One might also want to monitor right at the reservoirs as well, just to understand what the concentrations are before they are potentially subjected to contamination from these other sources. So like I mentioned earlier, we are currently in the pilot phase, and this is looking to wrap up later this year in the fall, where we're developing improved sampling methods and developing a guidance handbook to ensure that system operators and laboratory analysts are really following similar procedures and using the best available science. We'll also be training system operators in 2 in-person as well as virtual workshops later this year. We're providing time and resources for laboratories to get ELAB accredited, developing our data infrastructure so that we can receive the microplastics monitoring data in our systems, and developing a communication toolkit for water systems. As you'll learn later from our presenters, Dr. Bob Andrews and Hussein Al-Muhtaram, they are developing a comparison study for sampling procedures for microplastics in drinking water, shown here from the recent publication. We're working with the Moore Institute for Plastic Pollution Research to understand how best to collect data from laboratories in a harmonized way. This is what a single data set looks like for one sample. You can see there's a lot of different factors, a lot of data that needs to be captured somehow. Far more than just the particle count. We want to know the shape, the size, the polymer, the color for each individual particle that is measured. And so we're developing a unique source data pipeline that will allow laboratories to submit the full data set into the state's repository. SWRCB will also receive the very basic readout of that. How many particles per liter it is really the only thing that SWRCB is going to see. But that data is going to be linked to a standalone data portal that contains the breadth of data that we're looking for. This data portal, is really a way not just to capture the data, but also to harmonize the data and make sure that laboratories are not submitting data with errors. So this is sort of what the website looks like. You upload your data. If there's errors, it tells you how to correct them. And then once you have clean data, it fits all the rules of our portal, then you can get an input key to actually upload that to data.ca.gov, the open data portal. We're working with a lot of pilot project partners here, as shown here. And again, this is a huge effort. We're doing this for drinking water right now, but we are really leading the way for microplastics monitoring worldwide, and the United States other states are following in California's lead right now. This was called out in a recent report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And I think that you should all be proud and excited to be part of this groundbreaking and world-leading effort that California is embarking on. If you want to continue these discussions and keep up to date on everything that we're doing with our work groups, please join the Microplastics Monitoring Subcommittee of the California Water Quality Monitoring Council. This is a local and global community exchange of information and data for microplastics monitoring methods and tools that meets quarterly. We're developing, again, that sampling and analysis playbook, the communication toolbox, which you'll hear about again later today, and providing assistance for laboratory accreditation and data analysis. We also encourage you to check out some of these open tools that have been built by the microplastics science community. This is just a small subset of the many different free and open source tools that are available to researchers. And you can find all of these on Plasterverseorg. That's a website that I created to remove barriers on doing plastic pollution research. So thank you all for your attention. We are going to have a small Q&A session right now. So please feel free to use the Q&A box, or you can also, I believe, raise your hands and unmute. But thank you all.
Hi, everyone. I'm helping facilitate today. My name is Molly. I'm an environmental scientist with the Office of Public Participation at the Water Board. So as Scott said, you can use the raise hand function that's just on your toolbar down at the bottom of your screen if you would like to ask a question, or feel free to use that Q&A box. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so we have about 15 minutes for questions, and then we'll take a 10-minute break after that. I'm not seeing any questions right now. Oh, there we go, Louisa. I'm gonna allow you to speak. You should get a notification asking you to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Great. Not sure how to turn on my camera, but anyway. One of the questions I have, you mentioned some things about activities in the watershed in our letters. Maybe we can reference our latest sanitary survey. I mean, that document is quite comprehensive. And then maybe we can just summarize the takeaways from the latest sanitary survey and then just reference the document, or would that be appropriate? And just kind of try to tie it as best to the purpose, but of course the sanitary survey is not necessarily covering microplastics. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that'd be really good information for us to have available. If you could interpret that for us and, you know, make a recommendation for, well, based on the sanitary survey and X, Y, and Z from that, this is where we think we should be monitoring. We also included in the handbook a recommendation to monitor where you'd be monitoring coliform, as that is a similar sort of concept of contamination sources, and it's typically right before it enters a treatment plant as well. Some places might not be testing for that or not have a sampling port for that, in which case you might want to think more creatively and think outside those locations, but that would be a good starting place, I'd say, for systems.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next hand I see up is from Steve Sherman.
Yeah, I was wondering if the city of Azusa or Azusa Light and Water was also monitoring. The reason I say that is because in the past we've shared raw water sampling for our watershed sanitary surveys.
I can pull up the list right now. I don't believe that Azusa is on the list, but I want to be sure about that for you. I'll also drop a link in the chat to the policy handbook so we can all see the list.
Yeah, they have a membrane filtration there. I believe it's microfiltration. So maybe that threw them out of any kind of risk category.
Hey, Scott, this is Terry.
Azusa is not on the list.
Yeah, I don't see it there. Steve, we would have invited you to the member agency water quality managers workshop. If you are on this call and you weren't invited to our workshop on April 12th, that's because you're not on the list. So,
I was at that the meeting in Laverne at the Weymouth plant. That's what you're referring to.
yes,
Yeah, I was at that.
you did look familiar. Okay. Yeah, I don't see you on the list.
You don't see me on the list. I thought I was one of the agencies expected to monitor.
No.
Oh, then I retract. Will the list of agencies that are expected to monitor then be included in the chat notes or something here?
Yes, I just dropped the link into the chat, and then you can also look at the bit.ly/California system map. I also posted that in the chat. just give you an interactive map of all the systems on the list.
All right, thanks.
So we've got a question, who would be a point of contact to discuss the rationale for inclusion in phase 1 monitoring? You can contact me. I believe my email is easily findable on the internet, but it's also listed on the policy handbook. I'll also write that in the chat. I would also get in touch with your district engineer. Be good to coordinate with the State Water Board district that knows your system well before coming to me if you have any specific questions. Or at least loop them in.
And there's another question that went into the chat box. So I just reminded everybody to please use the Q&A for questions so that we can have them all collated in one place. It's easier to keep track of that way. But we had one in the chat that came up that says, how small are the NIST standard particles expected to be?
That's a great question. We're asking NIST to get down to 1 micron, but there may be logistical challenges of getting that small. It's still under development, and so I can't share much about what the final product will be yet, but we're aiming for 1 micron for this particular part of the project.
Okay, and Louisa asked another question in the chat. Based on the current pilot study timeline to conclude in the fall of 2023, when do you anticipate the source phase 1 monitoring to begin?
So this really depends on the completion of the pilot study, as Louisa mentioned, and we're looking at a timeline of finishing that up in the fall or winter of this year. And that's really will need to be necessary in order to issue the monitoring orders and get the people that are going to be collecting the samples trained. It's also dependent on ELAB accreditation. If there are no laboratories accredited for ELAB, by ELAB for microplastics, then we can't reasonably expect water systems to be monitoring. And so those 2 components are really going to determine when these monitoring orders go out and by what date data will need to come back to the state. So rough guess is that the orders are going to go out as soon as late this year, so winter or early spring next year, with data expected to come in by spring of next year or even summer of next year at the latest. Wish I could give a more exact timeline, but things are a little bit dynamic right now with the pilot phase. So we've got a question. It was mentioned that sampling training would be provided. Any details online, in person, or who will give it? So this will be organized by the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project in collaboration with Brown and Caldwell and the University of Toronto. It will be recorded and there'll be the ability to do this online, but we're also going to be having it in person. One event in Northern California, one in Southern California, and this would be sometime in the fall. We don't have a date yet set, so just look out for the email that will go out to you. We'll make sure that everyone that is on this list and that attended today's webinar will be kept in the loop for the sampling training. Yeah, so there was a question about, can we share the link? We should also, I should let you know that all of the information from today is going to be sent out. So my slides and then the recording, also the information on the number of water systems and their filtration level is listed in Appendix A of the policy handbook, which I'll drop that into the chat as well. We don't have any laboratories ELAP certified yet or ELAP accredited. We just have one that is quite close. We have others that are on the process. And so it's unclear what the capacity is going to be and by when, but other states are starting to monitor for microplastics, or at least they have plans to do that. New Jersey New York, and I've heard also Colorado. So there's going to be a high demand for microplastics monitoring moving forward. I anticipate that some larger commercial labs are likely going to come online soon. We'll see what the timeline is for that, though. Will this program be directed to surface water systems only, or both surface water and ground systems? As mentioned earlier, we do have 3 systems on our list that primarily use groundwater, and then 2 systems with groundwater under the direct influence of surface water. However, the vast majority of systems have surface water as their primary water type. And if you want to look at that again, the full list, again, is on attachment A of the policy handbook. So when will the pilot phase or phase 0 start, and when will it end? The pilot phase is currently underway. We are working with our collaborators that you'll hear from later in this webinar about how that's going for the sampling and analysis handbook, the sampling comparison method, and then the data harmonization platform, as well as the communication toolbox. So it started fall of last year, and we anticipate that it'll end fall of this year. We don't have exact dates for that yet, though. Is US EPA looking into microplastics and developing test methods for microplastics? Yes. We're working with the Office of Research and Development at the US EPA to evaluate test methods. They're not quite as far ahead as California is, but they're building off of our existing methods. It's unclear what their timeline is. I don't anticipate a standardized method coming out from EPA within the next couple of years, though.
All right, and looks like Brent has his hand up.
Yeah, Scott, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I typed the chat. Yeah, I typed a question into the chat, but I guess as a panelist, I can only see the questions and not pose them. So my question is a little bit technical, so I wanted to wait till other people had had a chance to weigh in. But I was surprised to see ion exchange pretty high on the list of technologies that reject microplastics. And I was curious to know from your review of literature what the mechanism was that accomplished that.
I don't know if there is a discrete mechanism that's been determined in the literature for that. My guess is that it is similar to a size exclusion principle, but I can see this publications if you want to look in deeper. I don't know the answer for that off the top of my head.
Okay, just curious. Thank you.
All right, looks like there's a question from Angela O'Brien in the chat. You mentioned a screening approach instead of analytical approach to identify potential risk of microplastics. Would you consider using this approach for the phase 1 source water monitoring?
So we can't do this for phase 1 because we don't have a screening approach developed. Included in the policy handbook are some surrogates that will be required for monitoring by water systems alongside the microplastics data they submit, and a list that is also optional. We have some front runners of surrogate methods that could potentially be used, but we don't have any defined surrogate methods or tier 1 methods yet. There's also some grants from the US EPA to innovators in the US to develop these phase 1 methods. And so potentially by the time we get to phase 2, there will be a surrogate method that we feel comfortable using, but we can't do that for phase 1. We just don't have that yet. The recording will be shared as well as the slides.
Also, By the way, I realized since Scott was just a panelist and not a co-host of the meeting, not everybody could see his messages. So I've pasted what he wrote into the chat, and Scott, I promoted you to co-host, so shouldn't have that problem again. And thanks to whoever sent us that anonymous message about that issue. Thank you. Okay. The recording. Okay. And did you see this question about what's the approximate cost of testing a sample, Scott?
It really depends on the laboratory running it. I've seen everything from $500 to $2,000. So it's really gonna depend. We'll see when we get an ELAB accredited lab that's running the State Water Board method, what they charge. When sampling is in place, where do we have the results reported to specifically? An example, do we send these to the state water boards? Yes. So included in the monitoring orders will be all the details of how to submit the data. First, the laboratory will need to submit the monitoring data to the open data portal that we have, the data harmonization tool. That'll check the data to make sure that it's reporting correctly. And if it passes all the checks, then they'll get a key that allows them to upload the data to data.ca.gov. That data will need to be cross-referenced with what goes into SWRCB. SWRCB will just be an extremely simple field. It'll just say how many particles per liter are there for a size range. So it'd be very simple what actually goes into SWRCB. Are there sampling toolkits available on the market? Nothing that is pre-made off the shelf. However, you'll see from the presenters later this afternoon that the materials to make this equipment, to build it yourself, is all relatively easy to acquire. Doesn't require big custom equipment. You can just buy it off of McMaster Car or some of the big distributors and put it together yourself. I anticipate that a lot of systems are going to want to share sampling equipment or go in a contractor together. We are also going to be providing 2 inline filtration devices for loan to systems. That loan program will be announced later this year. So it's another option. How is high and low filtration defined? You can see how it was defined in my presentation. I don't believe that the coding for that is in the policy handbook, but it was a broad strokes based on a literature review. Because there's so many uncertainties in the literature about exact removal rates, I had to bin things in fairly large bins from 0 to 30%, 30 to 90, and 90 and above. For systems sharing data for common source, will each system have to submit to SWRCB independently, but only once to the new portal where the laboratory reports the data? So in this particular case, where systems are choosing to consolidate and are approved for consolidated monitoring, then it will just be one system that will actually have to submit the data. It'll because it's a common monitoring point for the systems. So we'll have that conversation with individual consolidation plans about which laboratory, or sorry, which public water system ID will actually be the one submitting data.
All right. So looks like we've answered all the open questions right now, and we'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11:17, and then we'll hear from Brent Alsbach and Alma Besaragic.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this update today. And in reality, this is probably the most important 10 minutes I have with respect to the entire arc of the work that I'm going to describe in these two efforts, because it's one thing to develop these messaging resources that we're doing, and I'll describe those in the slides that follow, but it's another to disseminate the knowledge that's out there. So the first step of doing that, of course, is to make sure that we raise awareness that the resources exist, or in our case, will soon exist. So with the audience in this workshop here today being the most poignant group that this applies to, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to promote what we're doing and advertise it, so to speak, so that people will follow the progress. And then when it comes time the resources are available, you will know to look for them and then can utilize them to our benefit in terms of messaging about microplastics. So to that end, I'm going to talk about the two key resources that we're working on collectively. The first of which is Water Research Foundation Project 5155, and that is shown here. It's developing strategic consumer messaging for microplastics in drinking water supplies. And this is really a critical project because, as this group knows, the results from California's monitoring program will be publicly available, both by consumer confidence reports and by the publicly accessible database. And it's not just in California, because we know that environmental advocacy groups are already conducting sampling in drinking water supplies around the country. And as Scott mentioned, there are other companion bills around the country, New York City for one and New Jersey for another I know of, that potentially might follow in California's footsteps with legislating a similar microplastics monitoring program. And so if those come to pass, it's something like 1 in 6 people in the United States may have their drinking water monitored for microplastics. And as a result of that, customers will inevitably contact their water suppliers to ask questions about this topic. And it's not just the customers that live in those jurisdictions where the water quality is monitored, because consumers will see the issues out there and they will contact your utility not knowing whether or not it's actually being sampled in that jurisdiction. So across the country, this is going to be an increasingly important subject. We want to make sure we've got the resources to deal with it. However, to this point, considering all of the important priorities that utilities have with respect to lead and asset management and workforce and on, microplastics are relatively far down the list of priorities, and understandably so. But because of that, most utilities have not devoted any energy to microplastics, and you don't understand all the associated concerns with that. And there are also, of course, no outreach resources for utilities at this point in time, but that is exactly what this project aspires to change. So with that in mind, there are two research objectives, the first of which is to build water industry institutional knowledge about those microplastics issues specifically of greatest interest to the consumer. And then the second is to generate what appropriate messages are to address those concerns in response to primarily customer inquiries, but also potentially media inquiries as well. And this, as far as we're aware, is sort of this unprecedented proactive outreach effort, not proactive in the sense of reaching out to your customers, but proactive in the sense because usually when it comes to emerging contaminants, the industry is sort of caught on our back foot trying to respond to the wave of interest that it's already taken us over. But in this case, because of what California and other states are doing, we can see on the horizon the time in which consumers will eventually contact utilities about microplastics. So in this one case, we're able to develop those messaging resources before they're necessary. And that is, as far as we know, unique. And I certainly want to acknowledge the partner organizations that helped to make this research possible, the foremost of which is the Golden State Water Company, because this is a tailored collaboration project under the Water Research Foundation. And the Golden State Water Company is our utility sponsor. And then we have several research co-funders as well. And I want to thank all of these for their vision and proactiveness and understanding that this is an important initiative to fund and taking the steps to make that happen. And you see there are several California utilities listed here among the group. And then the American Chemistry Council as well. They are a non-monetary contributor because they have done their own market research and consumer outreach with respect to microplastics, albeit not with respect to drinking water specifically, but they have lessons learned from that effort that they agreed to share with us in a confidential manner in the context of our research. The team includes not only myself as the principal investigator with Arcadis, but also Patsy Tennyson from Katz & Associates as my co-PI, and Dave Metz from FM3 Research. And Dave's firm has done a lot of what we'll call scientific, statistically significant consumer surveys in our space, that is drinking water. So this isn't just surveys that we conducted for this research with respect to reaching out to people and seeing who responds to the web poll. This was a scientific survey carefully administered to make sure the results are, again, statistically significant within a defined confidence interval. And the list of tasks is shown here and the task lead for each of those respective items. But what I really want to focus on today is one, where we're at, which is resource development. But two, this is what's most important for this group to be aware of. And so the two key resources we're preparing are first a summary report, which is part and parcel of every Water Research Foundation project. And what will be included in that report includes that potential consumer knowledge about microplastics, some anticipated questions that we speculate consumers might ask their utilities so that you can be prepared in case that does come up, and then some additional background and context about those microplastics issues for utility reference specifically. Then the survey results are provided as an appendix to the report in raw form, which will enable additional analysis if other agencies or utilities find that that deeper dive may be appropriate. And then going into the findings, there are some general concepts that are important for everyone to understand. And then delving into microplastics specifically, first with respect to awareness and concern about this issue in drinking water and generally. And then what are some effective microplastics messages that were identified by virtue of this consumer survey. And then some messaging strategies that we identified for conveying those messages. And it also includes some general microplastics communications guidance, and then finally following up with some guidance specifically in responding to customer inquiries about microplastics. And the second resource is a series of 5 to 10 PowerPoint slides, which will serve as infographics. And these will identify those key messages in the survey, probably one message per slide. And they're suitable to be either an in-house reference for the utility as a sort of a quick guide, or if you choose to customize it, which we're going to enable it to do, to be a resource for discretionary distribution. So we'll have things like a place to insert the utility's logo, along with a hidden slide at the beginning that talks about the messages in brief and how those infographics could be used. But again, allowing the utilities to customize that if they choose to use them as an external facing resource. And just because I think it'll be very interesting for this group, we'll cover quickly a few key takeaways from the survey, and apologies to those that attended the workshop at Metropolitan's on-site. This will be a repeat for you, but for the rest, this will hopefully have some interesting information. So the first message is that Americans are highly satisfied with their water service. That 86% of respondents indicated that was the case. Consumer awareness about microplastics remains limited at this point. So only 39% indicated they had either a little or a great deal of familiarity with microplastics. And then that subgroup that had awareness, so again, it's a subpopulation of the survey pool, that group that expressed they had some awareness of microplastics in drinking water expressed concern, with 3 and 4 saying they were either extremely, very, or somewhat concerned about this issue. But then in the course of the survey, we first read them a statement about microplastics in drinking water to essentially then generate at least some baseline awareness of the issue among the entire sample population. And with that, then 65% of that bigger group expressed either extreme, either very concerned or somewhat concerned about this particular issue. And it's important to note that at this point in time, what we've shown here is a baseline effectively for microplastics awareness and concern in drinking water. It will be interesting to see over the course of the next several years as California's program unfolds and others around the country do likewise, how this may change with that baseline and increased consumer information going forward. Consumers were split on their confidence in their utility to address microplastics almost down the middle, with 50% expressing that they were either very confident or somewhat confident, with the rest a lesser degree of confidence in that ability. And then strategic messaging does increase confidence somewhat. So we moved the bar a bit from about 50% to more than 60%, again, expressing that they were either very confident or somewhat confident after hearing our messages about microplastics. But it's important to keep in mind, this is a broad spectrum of confidence, not with respect to any one particular message. And it's important to note that the respondents didn't get these messages directly from their water utility. So to them, at this point, the messages, which I'll show here, are still abstract. And so the numbers could actually be more if a utility, or that confidence rather, could be higher if they did actually get a specific message from their utility about this issue. So I don't have time to get into the messages in this brief presentation today, but topically, you see here they related to technology, water professionals working in the industry, the proactiveness of the utility with respect to microplastics and monitoring them in drinking water supplies, then preparedness to confront this issue, being at the forefront of research in microplastics, and their vigilance in staying on top of the issue and making sure that they are ready to address it. We asked them what their areas of greatest consumer confidence were, giving them a range of options, and the top two were assessing the impact of microplastics in drinking water. And here, although we didn't ask them more detail, it's reasonable to assume they interpreted impact in terms of human health and how that would literally impact them as an individual. And then detecting the presence of microplastics, those two rating at 64% and 61% respectively. The irony is that those two are probably the issues about which we are the least well prepared, meaning health effects and occurrence, thinking about how we're only able to detect down to a certain size of microplastics and really don't understand the detection of those smaller nanoplastic particulates in our drinking water supplies. Those areas of least consumer confidence were in the ability to treat water to remove microplastics, which ongoing research will help to counter, identifying sources of microplastics found in drinking water, and then communicating with customers about microplastics, which again, hopefully this project in particular will be able to correct as utilities communicate with their customers. And this is probably the most poignant result we found from the survey. And what it shows here are some options for individuals or organizations that were considered either a trusted source of information about microplastics or a source viewed as a suspicious source of information. And so there's a lot wrapped up in this, but I only really want to hit the one option at the top. So your doctor, or if one's personal physician, was by far the most trusted source of information, with a huge gap between that and the second person on that list, which is professors of water science. And then down beyond that, there's sort of almost a smooth curve of degrees of the differential between trust and suspicion, but a notable jump up to their doctors. So in this particular case, 82% of respondents indicated that they trusted their doctor as a source of information, while only 12% viewed that same person suspiciously. So that differential between 82 and 12 gives us the 70% number that's shown here. And what this indicates is there's a great opportunity for the water treatment community to engage with medical professionals to help with our messaging here, specifically about microplastics, but it's also reasonable to assume that could apply to other drinking water quality contaminants as well. So again, a great opportunity to potentially increase confidence just by this simple step, if we can, to find ways to engage the medical community in our messaging. So we hope that this resource, the final report and infographics, will be available in 2023, which should be well before they're needed for utilities in this group or elsewhere around the country to respond to an increase in customer inquiries about microplastics. And of course, there's a lot of bureaucracy that goes on once the final report is done to process it and then publish it on the Water Research Foundation's webpage. But we're crossing our fingers that by the end of the year, this will be complete. And if it's not by the end of 2023, it should be shortly thereafter. So I'm characterizing this as response messaging, and I say that because I've talked again and again about responding to customer inquiries, pointedly not reaching out to customers proactively about microplastics. And what the American Chemistry Council found, which was corroborated by our own research, is generally awareness equals concern. So customers aren't already asking about this, saying, hey, are you aware of microplastics, but you shouldn't be worried about it because we're doing X, Y, and Z. Effectively, what you really do is just open Pandora's box and make customers concerned about an issue they previously didn't even think about. So, of course, every utility knows its customer base best, and I wouldn't always just say as a blanket statement, don't proactively reach out, but certainly do that with a degree of caution, knowing that you could engender more concern than you assuage. But this gets us to a companion effort, which is informational messaging, not response messaging. And this is work conducted under the umbrella of the California Water Quality Monitoring Council, our consumer messaging work group specifically, which is a volunteer effort. And this is the second of the two resources that I wanted to mention, with the first being the Research Foundation work. With this volunteer effort, our group is intending to develop language for utilities to use in consumer confidence reports. So this is like the other direction of messaging. So the foundation report is for response messaging. Again, this is pushing the information out in conjunction with the consumer confidence reports, because we know the results from microplastics monitoring must be disclosed. And with that, it may be useful for utilities to include language about that. Now, in Scott's presentation, he talked about what the state's sort of stock language was, but this group is envisioning a more suite of options for utilities to potentially use at their discretion. So we're preparing a series of topical paragraphs as potential options for inclusion in consumer confidence reports. And those topic modules are with respect to sources, the occurrence, specifically in water supplies, of microplastics, treatment of microplastics in the plants, the health effects of microplastics, management of the issue, and then information about the state monitoring program. And our effort includes the guidance here to develop 1 to 2 paragraphs of content, so very short snippets, much like you would see in any other consumer confidence report. Our guidance is about 80 words or less, again, to make it short and succinct, avoiding demonstrative statements, and then trying to target sort of a 5-year-old mentality. Now, think about that hyperbolically. We don't obviously intend for 5-year-olds to read consumer confidence reports and look at information about microplastics, but sort of get the idea. We want to make sure that we use language that is identifiable and understandable to the broadest spectrum of potential readers of our consumer confidence reports. And here again, we hope the resources are available in 2023, and I think that should be the case. We're currently in the process of getting the drafts finalized now, and then we'll go through a group review, eventually getting to the point where they're ready to be posted at a place, and then we will advertise where that is for utilities and to use. So we have these 2 companion resources. Again, Water Research Foundation, Project 5155, which is intended to be response messaging, and then the Consumer Confidence Report work, which is sort of the proactive informational messaging to go along with the data that are disclosed. And certainly in particular with respect to the results of Water Research Foundation 5155, when that comes out, or even at this point in time, if you're interested as a utility, we're happy to conduct an organizational briefing as a lunch and learn or whatever format that works for any utility to talk about the results of the foundation project, because sometimes it's easier to get that as a download than it is to read the report. And certainly if you're interested, even for the preliminary results before the report gets published, to the extent that we're able to do that, we're happy to talk about the findings in a more one-on-one utility basis. So certainly reach out to us if that is of interest. And with that, here are contact information sets for myself and my colleague Alma Betrovic, who is helping me with this effort and with the consumer confidence work as well. So again, thank you for your attention and time today. I know I've extended my 10 minutes to 20, but this really is, to me, a very important opportunity, again, to raise awareness of these communications resources that will be available so that just people know they exist and can utilize them when the time is appropriate. So with that, I thank you and will take any questions that you may have.
All right, so Evelyn Wendell asked, will there be a portion in the strategic consumer messaging for microplastics report that addresses the fact that bottled water has hundreds of thousands more microplastics than tap water? We have a clear opportunity to present facts and perspective, and I wonder how this report will address this and recommend this to water utilities.
Yeah, so there is a chapter in the report, again, that talks about what consumers might know about microplastics based on what gets reported in the media, and then that additional context for water utilities. And like the discussion of bottled water is wrapped up in that because there are things utilities, our customers might know. And typically, maybe they're not thinking about this. They call the utility up and they say, "Hey, are there microplastics in drinking water?" Or "Why are there microplastics in my drinking water? What are you doing about that?" Then sort of that additional context is, well, many of the options that customers will gravitate toward when they're concerned about the quality of their drinking water are plastic-based, whether that's single-serving plastic water bottles or even in-home POE devices that have plastic components as well. And so, yeah, the short story is, yes, there will be a modicum of education in there to help utilities understand, yeah, hey, this is the case. Here's what consumers know. And here's that additional context it's important to understand that then can be conveyed to the customer.
Great, and Sarah Palmer suggested maybe a 5th grade level than a 5-year-old level might be required.
Yeah, it's an important context. Again, it's sort of a hyperbolic statement, if you will. I mean, certainly we're not gonna cater the language specifically to what a 5-year-old can understand, of course, but you get the idea.
All right, and Craig Parker asks, is there any definitive research that shows microplastics are dangerous to human health? And if yes, what are those dangers? I think
well, the work
Scott did touch on this,
yeah,
but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, I'd really defer to Scott. I mean, the work that we've done focuses on that to some extent at a high level by a literature review, and that will be in the report. To the best of our knowledge, it's uncertain, which is a very broad encapsulation of what Scott already shared. Certainly, he is much more knowledgeable about that than we are, so I'd really defer to him. But as far as I understand, the health effects, aside from oxidative stress, are not yet well understood.
All right, and we are running a little bit behind here, so we'll do one more question and then move on to Robert Andrews' presentation. Someone asked, will phase 1 monitoring data need to be reported in annual CCR in 2024? Oh, it looks like Scott's responding.
Yes, all of the monitoring data from the monitoring orders will need to be reported in the CCR. It depends on the timeline, but I imagine the 2024 will be the first time that it will appear.
And just to clarify, I think maybe it's important, is it the CCR that gets released in 2024, which would be 2023, or is it the monitoring results captured in 2024 would then subsequently be reported?
I think the latter, as we're not anticipating any systems to be required to do monitoring this year. I think the earliest that will be required will be potentially by December of this year or late this year, but more likely it's going to be spring of next year. So 2024, the end of 2024 is when they'll be reporting to the CCRs. So I guess that would be the 2025, looking a year back.
And again, just wrapping up, I really appreciate the opportunity and apologize. I did want to underscore these resources are going to be available, and just knowing this is the captive audience, the people that will probably most benefit from what we're doing, I really do appreciate the opportunity to get the information out there.
Thank you so much, Brent, for all the work you're doing and for sharing this presentation.
All right. Thank you, Brent. We're going to go ahead and move on to Bob Andrews from the University of Toronto. Take it away, Bob.
Okay, can everyone see the presentation okay?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Well, again, Scott, thanks for inviting us today. On behalf of Dr. Elmaterim and myself, just want to summarize some of the work that's being done regarding the evaluation and standardization of sampling methods for microplastics. And the information that I'm going to present today is based on some of the work that we've done over the past few years. I'm going to bring in excerpts of suggestions by other people, and then to ultimately say that the project that we'll be undertaking to compare sampling methods will be undertaking with Brown and Caldwell, and hopefully we'll be done that by the end of the year. So moving along, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I thought that this is a good example that kind of highlights the knowledge gaps with respect to sampling. These were a couple of points that were presented by Bart Coleman's, now going back about 4 years ago, and they're just as valid today. And there's a number of other things, but back then he was just saying, well, we've got to take a look at the sample volume that we collect, because that's going to be a function of the concentration of microplastics in both our source waters and our finished waters. And here he was just suggesting that we collect a minimum of 500 liters of surface waters. And then for tap waters, he was suggesting collect 1,000 liters. And if you wonder why, if you look at the results that people have obtained, you're going to see anything from 0.0001 particle per liter, which means we've got to collect at least 1,000 liters or more to see that particle, up to 10 to 100 particles per liter in finished water. But this is just one of the variables that we have to think about when we develop a sampling program. So I'm going to get right into it. And if you look in the DDW handbook, the method that's shown there is the ASTM method, which is based on a series of stacked open sieves. I'm just showing a picture on the bottom left there that illustrates there'll be a stack of different size sieves. Don't pay attention to the numbers I've shown there. They're just for illustration. And what you will do is pour the water through, or direct a hose with water through the top sieve and going through the bottom sieve. And so this, in my mind, is a gravity filtration type of setup. And it's really going to be the amount of flow that you can put through is going to be dependent on the smallest size sieve or filter that you try and pass the water through. But I want to take this opportunity as well to highlight a couple of very important points. A lot of people think that when we filter, say, 100 or 1,000 liters of tap water, let alone source water, all we're going to see is a bunch of microplastics and nothing else on the filter. And that's anything but true. There's approximately 1,000 other particles for every microplastic particle that we're finding. So that means we're really looking for that needle in the haystack when we're trying to tease out the microplastics that may be as small as 1 or 2 microns. So when we sample, you will have the particles retained on the sieves. Then what's necessary is a method to extract those particles from the sieves. And typically this may involve sonication or a cleaning method where you collect all of that water. Then you pass that water through a filter, typically a polycarbonate filter that's smaller than the smallest filter size, to isolate or to concentrate all the particles. Then from there, you need to remove all of the organic and inorganic particles so that you can actually see the microplastics particles when you go to analyzing using Raman or FTIR. And that digestion method that is applied typically can take a couple of days to conduct. And based on how much organics and inorganics are there and the type of digestion method that you use will depend upon the success that you have then for going to an analytical method such as Raman or FTIR. So I just want to underscore those additional steps. So if we look at the two methods that ASTM suggests, one is, hooking a line up directly to a tap and then, placing a tap, say, over this stack of filters. Or if you're unable to do that, collect water in, say, 20-liter glass carboy, pour it through the filter stack. What I really need to caution people of is that you're going to form a cake layer on the smallest sieve, especially if you're going for less than 20 microns, and that will prevent the flow from passing through, and then you'll get the water backing up through the other sieves. So this is something that really has to be carefully watched when you're doing it. The other thing as well is if you're directing a concentrated flow, you're only actually utilizing maybe 5 or 10% of the filter area. The other way is if you can't hook up to a pressure system, for example, if you're trying to take a sample from a clear well, you're going to need a submersible pump that's going to act as the water supply, which will be throttled through some type of valve, and then again pass the water through the sieves. So this is just really a general overview of what's involved with this method. If we then go and look at, okay, well, how many sieves am I going to use? What size? Well, this is all going to be dictated ultimately by, how many microplastics are present in the water, which will dictate how much volume you need to collect. And also the smallest size, once you plug that sieve off, then you won't be able to get any more water through. So for surface water, this is the stack that ASTM is suggesting. And then for finished water, it would be, a larger size sieve prior to a 20 micron sieve. But it really is going to be dictated by the objectives of the study. And if the objective is to go below 20 microns, then you would need something smaller than a 20 micron sieve. Two important points that I've mentioned, but I want you to note, is that we use decreasing successive sieve sizes because we don't prematurely want to plug the smallest sieve. And just think about a dual media filter, with anthracite over sand, we just don't want to plug off the sand very quickly. Also, the amount of volume that you'll be able to put through is dependent on the smallest size sieve. And it's also dictated in part by the water quality. Remember, if you've got 1,000 other particles per microplastic particle, these are what's going to blind off the sieve. Also, it's going to be dependent on how you're going to extract those particles, all of the particles, including the microplastics, from the sieves or your sampling equipment, and then how you're going to digest that sample to minimize the interferences by other organic and inorganic particles. And this is something I think that's got to be worked out with the commercial labs, because are the commercial labs going to do this for you? Or is this going to be anticipated that you deliver them a sample that's ready for FTIR or Raman analysis? So I think this is a question that still needs to be addressed. Just a couple of methods that I'd like to discuss. The ASTM method is based on open sieves. So one potential disadvantage is you can get atmospheric particles contaminating while you're collecting the water. So an alternative method that may be used is to have a complete closed system. And this was a method we started off with a few years ago, where we just took a 47mm polycarbonate filter, sandwiched it between stainless steel casing, put water directly through that, and then we could go immediately to digestion. We didn't really have to extract anything off of the filter itself. And I guess the downside of this is you can't get a lot of water through these. Typically about 10 to, at the best, maybe 100 liters of water, but you can arrange these either in series to try and maximize the flow, or you can put them in parallel to maximize the surface area. And in fact, this is a 47 millimeter filter I'm showing, for example. You can also purchase 90 millimeter filters and 142 millimeter filters. And this was all discussed in a paper we published previously. The method that we have evolved because we do a lot of sampling is shown in this picture. And if some of you have seen this at previous conferences, then this will just be kind of a reminder. What you'll need to have if you use this canister method, and we like this the same as the smaller inline method, because you can prepare and clean all of this equipment before you go into sampling, and it's completely sealed until you bring it back to the lab. And what this consists of is initially a pressure relief valve. We've found that you have to keep the pressure less than about 60 to 70 PSI, or you will in fact compress or deform the sieve itself. You need to have some type of flow control valve. We've automated this system again, but a simple ball valve is quite adequate. And then just a pressure gauge, so you know what the pressure is on both sides of the canisters. And then at the end, you're going to need some type of totalizer. We typically use 2 totalizers, one for a higher flow rate, say less than about 10 liters per minute, and one for a smaller flow rate, because the flow will decrease as the filters start to blind off. So I'm just going to put this up into the upper left. If you want to look inside, what's inside these stainless steel canisters, there'll be a stainless steel filter mesh. These can be purchased in many sizes down to 2 microns. And we typically will use 2 filters in series, typically about a 20 micron and a 2 micron. But again, this is all dictated by the objective of the study and the minimum particle size that you have the ability to separate, and also the ability to analyze, whether it's by FTIR or Raman. We've also just designed an automated system that is pretty much plug and play, that allows us to record the amount of volume of water, how long it took to get that, and we have all of the information. And also we've just developed a way of shipping these around to facilities. And if you want more information on this, we felt it was very prudent to get a paper out there that talked about the need to standardize the way we sample microplastics. So you can look this up from October of last year in ES&T. So where are we going with this work that we're currently doing for Scott in the state? Well, one is to compare the ASTM to an inline, and this would be the canister type filter. What we want to do is maximize the microplastics that can be recovered, and also at the same time minimize any potential contamination. Also, to validate in the field the use of both methods by applying them at a few different water treatment facilities, so that one can very much foresee the advantages, the disadvantages associated with each of the methods. And this will all be in the final report that we prepare. So with that, Dr. Elmaterim is on as well today. So I would ask for any questions that hopefully one of the two of us can answer.
All right. So it looks like we have one question so far in the Q&A from Joe Lyons, who says, are there any results of the pilot sampling so far that can be shared? For example, what are the levels of microplastics that have been observed so far?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Joe. We've sampled a few treatment facilities in the past couple months. From our work, we can see, maybe, 100 to 200 particles per liter in raw waters. And we're seeing about 90% reduction through conventional treatment. And I think that's very good news. So my anticipation is we're going to see about an 80 to 90% reduction in conventional treatment. We've also sampled facilities using ultrafiltration, where we see essentially 99 to 100% removal. And this is looking down at particles as small as 1 micron. And we'll hopefully be presenting more results at ACE next month, and as well as at WQTC. Are the containers reusable? Yes, absolutely. These are fairly expensive. You're going to be looking at over $1,000 for a canister and a filter. We have used them multiple times. So the question regarding cleaning is really, really important. You have to find a way that you can get everything off of this. And we've been using sonication as well as adding a little bit of surfactant. This is really going to depend on the water type. And we're trying to actually perfect a cleaning method, because you got to remember, you want to recover all of the microplastics. But that said, once you get them off, I would say these could be reusable hundreds of times. The question, how much would it cost to build one of the high capacity? I would say you could do this for under $5,000. And yes, there will be a recommended list of parts. Again, I don't want anyone to get too far ahead of themselves, because we are comparing this to the ASTM method. And I really want to see the results of that before making any firm recommendations. And in fact, Scott will be the one making the recommendations. The ideal flow rate, that's a good question. We've looked at flow rates in finished waters. We've passed about 250 liters per hour, so we're able to collect 1,000 liters in about 4 hours. And for raw waters, it's really going to depend on the amount of particulates in that water, but it's going to be, I would say, you may double or triple that amount of time. But this is all really dependent on the smallest sieve size that you use. But we know, as Scott mentioned earlier, is that the majority of the microplastics are going to be in the less than 20 micron size range. So it is advantageous to try and use the smallest sieves that are possible, that are practical. How would an equivalent blank be evaluated? Well, you would need to have a field blank if you were using the ASTM method, where you don't have a completely closed system. In the canister method, what we do is we clean everything in a microplastic-free atmosphere using microplastic-free water in the lab. We then seal it. We then take it to the field. They're sealed in the field and brought back. So we have found that we have very, very little, if any, contamination using that method. Are there any other questions? Prevent external microplastic contamination from clothing when assembling this. Yeah, again, we have done quality control to make sure that we're not contaminating our own equipment. Again, this is done in a microplastic-free atmosphere. We're cleaning with all microplastic-free water. And we have found that we have very little, if any, contamination. Question is, how big and heavy will the setup be? I would say, in the order of likely 20 pounds. This is something, if you have sample taps available in the lab, we have set these up on lab benches, hooked them up to the sample taps. So the size should not be an issue. Question is, will water utilities be responsible for building the system? This comes back partially to the type of system that will ultimately be recommended. And yeah, I fully appreciate that most facilities don't have clean room type environments, and I can't give you that answer today. Related question, does either of the methods have requirements on sampler clothing or procedures? I have not seen any standardized methods with respect to those questions. Question is, how do we store between usage and keep it from getting contaminated? It's a good question. When we bring it back to the lab, we sonicate the sieves to try and get everything off of them. Then we clean them with a tween solution, and we assume that they're 100% clean. Then what we've done is passed microplastic free water through those just to give ourselves that added assurance. Then we have plugs that go into them so that they are sealed, and they can be sealed for up to months because they're in a totally enclosed system. And the question is there a certain pressure required to push water through? We typically find line pressure at most facilities we have sampled to be sufficient. If you need to use a pressure pump, such as a submersible pump, we've found that you just don't want to go much above 60 to 70 PSI. And that's why we have included a pressure relief valve at the start of the system, so that pressure goes up that high, it will bypass. How much square footage is needed? I would say if you had an area that was, say, for example, 2 feet by 3 feet, that would be about the footprint.
All right, lots of great questions. If you happen to think of some while we're on our lunch break, make sure you drop those in the Q&A box and we can revisit them when we get back. So with that, we're going to go ahead and take a 30-minute lunch break until about 12:30. And when we get back, we'll resume with a presentation from Terry Slifko from the Metropolitan Water District. All right, welcome back, folks. It's 12:30, so we're going to start our workshop back up again. Maybe just wait another minute for people to kind of meander back. Hopefully, if you're in another room, you can hear me and make your way back to your computer. And then I'll let Terry take it away with her presentation in just a minute.
Yeah, well, while we're waiting for people to come in, let me see if I could get my screen shared. And can you hear me okay? Sound check?
Yep, can hear you, can see your slides.
Okay, from the beginning. Great.
Yeah, and it's 12:31, so go ahead and get started.
Okay, sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Terry Slifko. I am the chemistry unit manager at Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Really appreciate this opportunity for the invitation to talk about our journey on developing a monitoring plan for our in the area of Southern California. Metropolitan is a wholesale water system. And as a regional water wholesaler, we deliver water to 26 member agencies, which includes 14 cities 11 municipal water districts, and 1 county water authority. And then in turn, directly or through their customers, they provide water to approximately 19 million people in Southern California. So I just wanted to show this map to get an idea of the area. And I'll talk about this in a little bit. So Scott invited this presentation to sort of talk about our journey into developing a monitoring plan. Because we have such a complex system, we wanted to bring together the water systems. And so there are 30 water systems listed in the handbook, and 10 of those, including Metropolitan, are within Metropolitan service area. So we wanted to be able to prepare for the phase 1 source water monitoring that's coming up. So it was, we put our heads together to try to figure out how are we going to answer the questions for where are we going to monitor, which supplies are strictly Metropolitans, which, where the customer might purchase water from us and in turn sell it to some of the retail agencies that are listed in that handbook. And we don't have that information. So we brought together a workshop and a webinar. So the webinar, we have a member agencies water quality managers meeting about quarterly each year. And this was a very specific one where it was a special topic session on microplastics. And the first part of the day was just online. Everybody that was invited to attend the in-person workshop, some of them did come. And so we had like a hands-on in-person meeting where it was the people, the agencies and representatives of those agencies and retail agencies that are within those 9 agencies that were listed in the handbook within our service area. So we had a great participation, over 120 online participants in the morning on the webinar, with about 20 people that were at the lab. And then we had more that came in just for the workshop in person. Most member agencies were represented. We had one other member agency that was representing 2 other systems. So we were able to cover our bases in terms of having a lot of interest and a lot of participation. Scott was there. I'll show you the agendas in a second, but we gave a full background on legislative requirements, sampling, collection and analysis, and a little bit of background on what we know about treatment so far. And so we also talked a little bit about public communication. And so Brent was there, and he was able to present a very similar talk to what he presented to us today. Then the afternoon, we had some lunch. In the afternoon, we had a very focused discussion with about 25 attendees representing all 9 member agencies and retail agencies. And we talked about sampling locations, about our water sources that are shared, and we had a great discussion. We did not detail and figure out exactly who's going to be presenting, but the goal was to look at all these systems and figure out who, where it makes sense to monitor, and if there is some redundancy, to be able to reduce that redundancy. And we had a fantastic discussion. So this was the morning presentation, where just quickly, I gave a little background on treatment, and what we know now is sort of like a literature survey. Scott, gave his morning overview about microplastics, then the public messaging projects that Brent just talked about, and then we had lunch, and then we had the afternoon in-depth discussions. Scott went into more detail about the DDW's monitoring plan requirements, what is expected, and then I was able to, along with some Metropolitan staff that were there, discuss our big system and where the existing monitoring locations are and where it would make sense to monitor at at our systems. And then each of the member agencies was asked a series of questions. So these agency profile we do and have one-on-one interactive and discussion. I can't tell you how valuable this was. If you're a wholesale water system and you haven't had this discussion with your agencies, I do suggest that you do this. I'm getting a note that my internet connection is unstable. So if I'm cutting in and out, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and go off camera. All right. So let's see if I could advance this slide. All right. So the purpose of this workshop was to provide the dedicated forum so that all of our member and retail agencies that are identified in the handbook could talk about the monitoring plan requirements and the sources where we don't necessarily have all of the information that they have. They know their systems best, right? So it was really important to get that information out in the discussion, and it was helpful for not just them but also for Scott. And what would make sense? We had a lot of feedback with respect to the questions about where to sample, how to do it. So we had the 3 goals: to establish this dialogue, identify the relevant monitoring locations, reduce redundancy if needed. If we could, our goal was hopefully to, reduce the redundancy, and then develop a framework that not only Metropolitan could use, but also our member agencies and retail agencies could use for developing their own monitoring plan. All right, just a minute on Metropolitan's water sources. I mentioned it covers a wide area. We have 2 main supplies that come in. The state project water comes in at 2 different locations, and Colorado River water comes in at another location. The yellow and green dotted line represents a blended untreated supply. What's complicating the Southern California monitoring plan development is we have reservoirs. And so it's not simple. So because we have all these reservoirs and the other agencies may have their own reservoirs and other water supplies coming into their system. So we had to talk about that. This slide is just another example representing our service area. And then these are our 5 main water treatment plants. We have about, so I just wanted to illustrate, these are the main treatment plants, and with the different water sources and the different reservoirs, it did make a difference on who receives the water, what their primary water supply from Metropolitan, and in that case, they maybe not need to monitor, or if their supply is Metropolitan, but that's like only 0.1% of the time, maybe they don't need to monitor. And so the percentage of the supply was a question that we discussed. And these are all of the public systems that are in our service area, representing the high filtration, low filtration, and medium filtration that Scott mentioned in his presentation. And so we went around the table talking about each one to develop the profile to figure out, does it make sense for them to monitor? The link that's listed on here is that map, the interactive map that Scott mentioned. So if you want to write that down, you can go ahead and pull up a map, and your system is, if you're in the handbook, your system is on there too. So the profile questions included the main point of contact for the agency. So we had our member agency water quality managers, but through time, people have changed. You know, they've moved on. We have other new faces in the arena. So it was also an opportunity to meet a lot of our of the people face to face for the first time since the pandemic. So it was really good to meet everybody. We were able to talk about who it was that would be the main point of contact, who was going to be taking the sample, and a lot of other very specific information that we needed to have to understand how we're going to develop a monitoring plan and what they needed to know to develop theirs. So what are your untreated water sources was a good question. Like I said, there was a lot of different supplies, groundwater, and other reservoirs that we don't have access to or maybe didn't even know about and think about. And then what was your biggest source of drinking water in terms of the percentage and where are they getting it from? We talked a lot about where to collect the microplastic samples. In the handbook, it recommends the location where cryptosporidium and Giardia samples were collected for UCMR. But those locations for UCMR weren't necessarily source water, untreated water. Those locations for UCMR 5 or UCMR whatever were at the point of entry to the distribution system after treatment. So it might not make sense, at least in phase 1, to use the same exact location. So we had, you know, we became aware of some of the nuances with respect to where crypto and Giardia are located, and then where water supply, you know, untreated water monitoring for coliform bacteria is also collected, which is why Scott mentioned possibly if you have an opportunity to collect at the coliform location for when you're monitoring for coliforms in your untreated supply. Is this location convenient? Sometimes it wasn't. So going out to the reservoir and throwing a hose in the lake maybe is not an option. And so we did talk a lot about where should we take it? And we all agreed that it would be easiest if we had tap and some place that had a tap. We talked about other challenges that we may have or they may have, or in terms of anticipating collection, and especially collecting such high volume samples. Some systems don't have the staff resources to collect. Certainly, we talked a lot, and there were some really good questions in the presentation after Dr. Andrews' presentation about, well, I don't have a clean room to prep the sampling equipment. Where am I going to get the sampling equipment? How am I going to collect these samples if I don't have people or resources to do so? And so this was super helpful. And we talked about the surrogates. So the handbook specifies required surrogates monitoring, and we did determine that many of the systems don't regularly collect some of the surrogates that are listed there, namely TOC and TDS. So that might be something that could be a little tricky in terms of developing the monitoring plan. And then also how and where the potential surrogate parameters should be collected. And so we discussed how to do that. Scott provided excellent Q&A and guidance on when and where the surrogates should be collected. So I'll let him answer that during our Q&A. Okay, so that was my last slide. So I did want to run through a couple of less, take-home messages. So one of the things that showed up that we didn't expect was that some agencies didn't know that phase 1 monitoring had been delayed. So if you guys already didn't get that out of this workshop today, just to make it clear, the pilot phase is still underway, and Scott can clarify me if I say this wrong, that the pilot phase is super important. We have to have these standard operating procedures for sample collection before we can go and collect samples for phase 1. So we really do need standard operating procedures developed and published, and after they're validated and published by DDW. Another thing is not all of our systems were aware that they were required to monitor for microplastics, or that they were in the handbook, or that the handbook was available to them for review. There's a couple of small systems, and so it was really helpful for them to be there so that they understood what was going on and what might be required of them. And to have somebody to talk to about any questions that they may have moving forward. They might get a letter in the mail later saying, hey, you have to take this, or we need a monitoring plan from you. And so if you haven't reached out to your water systems yet, it might be helpful just to have a talk about it. Another takeaway was Metropolitan's water system and our member agencies' water systems are very complicated, and especially because of the water storage areas and the alternative supplies that are received. So we could not have developed a monitoring plan for anybody except for Metropolitan, and they'll have to do their own monitoring plan because they know their systems the best. And the state could not develop monitoring orders without this type of input. So this forum that we're in right now and that forum that we had was really critical in terms of providing input about the complicated nature of some of our water systems and what would make sense and what would not make sense for monitoring. I already mentioned some of this. We did identify a couple of systems that probably won't have to monitor. They need to talk with Dr. Coffin to clarify that. And I believe that information is also going to be formally conveyed with that letter that he was asking us about. The state, oh, this was really important too. The state database that the state board has access to isn't necessarily completely updated. There are a couple of mistakes in the database. For example, the population for one of the systems said it was like 300,000, but that system only has about 30,000 or 80,000 in their service area. So that needs to be updated. Okay, I'm just going through my notes right now. So the surface water supplies that are not significant. So if you have a supply and you don't have a high percentage going into your system, it was recommended to have a discussion with DDW, with Scott, about whether or not that system should monitor. So if you're mainly groundwater and it's in the state database that you have a large supply from surface water, have a conversation with Scott. I already mentioned the total dissolved solids and TSS are not normally sampled for many of the systems. We also, many of us were really comforted by, look, if you have a tap, collect there, not necessarily at the lakeside, if you have an option. Like, for example, a plant influent would be best, but this is another thing. If you have a system that's unique, talk to Scott about it. We also realized that we really do need a standardized SOP for sample collection, and we have to get the equipment or find a way to borrow the equipment. And if we have to, depending on how often we have to take the samples, we might need dedicated equipment. And depending on if systems have staff and resources to collect the samples, they might even need help collecting the samples. So that is all that I had in terms of an update. Let's see if my system will stabilize. Okay.
All right, thank you, Terry. We did have a couple technical difficulties there, but
Yeah, I think I could take questions.
yeah, I think we were able to capture everything you were saying. It wasn't too distorted to
Oh,
what you were saying. No worries. It was a little going in and out, but other times sounded perfect. So
okay, yeah, I'm working on a hotspot today because I have no Wi-Fi.
yeah, those struggles. Okay, Louisa has a question for you. She said, thank you, Terry, for the excellent presentation. Very helpful. How do you plan to address the situations when a WTP influent received a primary source and an occasional inflow from a reservoir? And if I was breaking up for you, you can always read the
No,
question.
I'm reading it.
Oh yeah, no
Okay.
worries.
Yeah, the influent received from a primary source and an occasional inflow from a reservoir. That's something I think Scott needs to answer.
Very much going to be on a case-by-case basis. I think the information that DDW would want is how much water comes from that inflow from the reservoir. What's the frequency, the volume, on like an annual basis, and does it fluctuate by season? We'd also want to know, how does the water get from that reservoir to the treatment plant? Is it an open canal? Is it a pipe? That would indicate whether or not we anticipate there's going to be additional contamination by the time it gets to the plant, those sort of factors. And I would recommend working with, again, your district engineers, at least looping them into the conversation. They can provide input.
Scott, I had a question for you. Are you going to send us or email us a list of what is expected for the letters, like a guideline?
Yes, I covered briefly and in a slide today what's expected. I mean, I can reiterate. Basically, it's a short letter that includes a map and a rationale for where you want to monitor. And then it'll be a conversation. You know, if we determine that that's enough information, we can proceed with a decision. And if not, then we'll request additional information. We'd also like to understand, if you have multiple sources, what percentage approximately comes from each of those sources each year.
Each year? Okay. And so, like, when we have questions, we feel like you're so responsive, and we're really grateful for that. So I'm assuming that all of the water systems on that list can call you or email you and to have a discussion about their system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to chat with you all and make some time to meet. Again, looping in the district engineers, I think is going to be really helpful.
Okay. Well, if anybody else has any more questions for me, I did have a couple of questions for other people, but I'll hold that for the Q&A, the discussion part of this. I did want to say thank you to Scott and Brent for presenting at for Metropolitan and for coming out, and also thank you to Metropolitan staff for helping to support the event. It was really, really helpful, and also to all the member agencies that and the representatives that came. Thank you for joining us. I think a lot of you are online today.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting on this, Terry, and for holding that workshop. Metropolitan, obviously very complicated system, so it's good to see how you all are thinking about this and the different factors going into your considerations. I've got a question. When will DDW guidelines and the template for letter of request be available? We'll make that available at the end of this presentation with the slides. We don't have a template letter. I can give you an example of what we're looking for. Again, it doesn't need to be very, very long. A couple pages is fine.
Looks like if there aren't any more questions for Terry right now, we could move into the open discussion portion of the workshop. So Terry, I know that you had a kickoff for that if you wanted to ask that question to the group.
Yeah, so this was a continuation of a couple of the questions for Dr. Andrews and also Scott. Okay, so regardless of the sampling apparatus, sample contamination has been an issue and a concern for pretty much every study that I've read. They all report, and the good ones report it, that yes, all of our samples were contaminated, including the blanks. And so helping to reduce the contamination during sample collection, we're going to have the sampling apparatus, whatever it might be, and it's supposed to be cleaned and QC'd, meaning verification that it doesn't have any contamination, in a clean lab, preferably a laminar flow hood. But there's a lot of systems that won't have access to that. How are we going for these systems that don't have access to laminar flow hood or even the ability to purchase a $5,000 sampling apparatus? How are we going to take samples?
Yeah, that's a great question. I anticipate that there will be some services available commercially for this. Some of the analytical labs may be able to do this in-house so that you can basically just deliver the sampling equipment to them. And then after they extract the samples and clean it, put it back together, then they can hand it back to you. There might even be services that will go out and do the sampling for you and do the analysis, or hand it off to the lab to do the analysis. That's one option. I guess it's really going to be in a case-by-case basis. Some facilities will have the laminar flow hood, and they'll choose to do it in-house and do their own analyses, like Metropolitan, and some facilities won't. I don't know if you want to do it, Bob.
Yeah, I would hope that the commercial labs pick this up, because ultimately they're going to do the analysis of the sample. And one question in my mind has always been, what form do they envision receiving that sample? And, if we came up with a standardized set of sampling equipment, that could be delivered to the commercial lab, they extract it, they digest it, they analyze it, then they clean the equipment and send it back out. But I'm not sure that that's a service that they've thought about, but it's something someone needs to think about.
So a couple of the lessons learned from LT2 monitoring for cryptosporidium and giardia, which are also particles, small particles. The standard operating procedures included the sampling part of it. And so it was important and really critical because of the losses that were observed during the sample collection and also preparation. And, so you have a filter similar to what we're going to do here. And then we have to take the sample, elute the oocysts and cysts off the filter, kind of like what we're going to do here. And so that standard operating procedure mattered, because whenever we're trying to optimize recovery efficiency for any analytical method like this, you start from you start and you optimize each part of it. And then there's like this recovery efficiency range that's acceptable. Scott mentioned that it takes time to gain experience for sample analysis, where the analysts that have more experience, particularly with microscopy, and presumably with the LDIR and the other the infrared spectroscopy and any other method that they might be using to confirm that it's plastic, they're going to get better with time. And so the initial monitoring period for you know, the EPA's program for cryptoangiardia, the initial data were not that good. And this is even more tedious, this analytical method. So because of the nature of microplastics, just different sizes, shapes, particles, chemistries, you know, everything, fibers. So it makes it even more complicated. So I really appreciate the flexibility of the state board to understand and acknowledge that this takes time to develop, but also there might be other things that we might want to do in terms of optimizing the method, standardizing and validating the protocol once it's all put together. So that the laboratory results from, if you have 3 different labs that are approved or 6 or whatever, can be compared with each other. I guess that's not a question. So it's a request. We need some time to do that. So.
That is one of the goals of the pilot phase, is to conduct a sort of round robin for the labs that are seeking or are ELAP accredited, to make sure that we're getting consistent results across laboratories. And if there are discrepancies, then to work with those laboratories to figure out what they are, what's causing that.
So we're going to have contamination. How are we going to handle the contamination in the labs?
So ideally, you have systematic controls to reduce contamination in your laboratory, but there's always going to be some. And our protocol has methods for background subtraction that is based on statistics. So using information about the color, the shape, the size, and the polymer of the particles to determine what's likely coming from the analyst in the room, and what's possible, or what's actually in the sample. So that's sort of a backup, but hopefully labs get to a point where the amount of background subtraction they need to do is minimal, very low percentage.
I have more questions. Nobody else does. Scott, you see?
Yeah, I've got a question about costs. Again, I can only ballpark here because nobody's offering this method commercially yet. So I'm sticking with my original range that I've seen, which is $500 to $2,000. We have one lab that's very close to being ELAP accredited. They're a nonprofit lab, but there are quickly going to become other labs. I'm aware of one other lab, a larger commercial lab that is interested. And so, you know, the more we have, the more the price will attenuate and be competitive on the market. So stay tuned, I would say. By the end of this year, I anticipate there will at least be 2 labs ELAP accredited. That's just my guess. Will the approved lab provide the travel blanks? So here, the travel blanks would really only be necessary if one is using the ASTM method, as the canister filter doesn't require travel blanks if there's no chance of contamination out in the field. Looks like people are starting to drop off. We have on the schedule until 1:30 if anyone wants to ask any questions, but if we're not getting any questions or dialogue, then we can end the meeting early. But folks, feel free to raise your hand or use the Q&A. A question about the surrogate analyses. So are they expected to be performed by an ELAP accredited lab? That's a very good question. It depends on the method. A lot of these surrogate methods are online monitoring techniques or routine analyses. In the case of an online monitoring tool, that I don't believe those are have ELAB field of accreditation methods. So in that case, we wouldn't expect an ELAB method, or sorry, lab to be running those. But in the case of sort of routine like water quality analyses that laboratories would need to be accredited for, then we would expect them to be accredited for those analyses. So it is definitely on a case-by-case basis for the surrogates. Will there be any funding provided for this testing? Anything available through the CRV redemption? It really depends on whether or not your water system qualifies for funding through the SAFER program. So that's where the main funding would come. But if you're a large water system that would not get funding from the SAFER program, it's unlikely we're going to provide any funding, additional funding for this effort. If the water systems will need to build a sampling apparatus, presumably we would need to install the filter into the steel holder. There would be a risk that the filter would be contaminated during installation. How would that be assessed? Right, so this is where we would hope that the laboratory putting together the sampling apparatus is doing it in a controlled laminar flow hood, following a standardized protocol, following all the steps that Dr. Bob Andrews outlined, and that will be typed up in a protocol, ensuring that the filter is not contaminated when you take it out into the field. So we don't recommend that systems just try and build this on a bench top, put the components together. It really needs to be done in an extremely controlled and systematic way with proper materials and facilities. Are we in communication with any laboratory that is planning on offering sampling services as well as analysis? I've heard from one laboratory that is going for ELAB accreditation that is interested in this. I'm entertaining additional discussions with any labs or contractors that want to be involved with that. In terms of an eventual round robin of sampling and analysis methods in the pilot phase, would only those two nearly accredited labs be considered to participate, or would newly set up labs be allowed to participate? We would not close the participation just to labs that are accredited or about to become accredited. We would open this round robin to any labs that want to participate. It would be a fairly low investment for labs to do, as the sample would already be extracted and on a static plate. So they'd really just be shipping the sample around to each other and testing that one sample or a couple. So if you work for a lab and you want to get involved with this round robin, just let me know. We'd love to, the more the merrier with this. Will DDW provide a list of ELAB approved labs as well as those that can provide sampling services before issuing monitoring orders? Absolutely. Yes, ELAB always lists the accredited labs. They have a web tool where you can see this for other analytical methods. We'll do the same for microplastics, but we'll also make that information a little bit more accessible, especially if there's some add-on services like sampling available.
Scott, I had a question on the ELAB website. The two methods are there with size ranges. So when laboratories are applying for ELAB certification or for each method?
Oh, I'm sorry. There was some delay.
Yeah. So on the ELAB website, there are size ranges listed for both methods. So for laboratories seeking ELAB certification, should they select all the size ranges, even if it's something that they're not interested in looking at? I mean, like over 100 microns. the different size categories are all listed there.
Right. So those fields of testing are really just what will appear as the final analyte in SWRCB. So a laboratory running the Raman method, for example, will need to get accredited for the 20 micron fraction and up, but also all of the larger fractions too. So greater than 212 microns fraction as well. And so we want, yeah, they need to get accredited for all three applicable to each method they're running. When the data is submitted to the state, the only thing that will appear on SWRCB is the concentration of particles per liter in that size range. It won't tell you the polymer, it won't tell you the shape or any other information in SWRCB. It'll just be one number per size range. And then that will be cross-linked with the standalone microplastics database that has all the additional information.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
As a reminder, folks, too, if you want to chime in, you just need to raise your hand and then I can allow you to unmute yourself. So it looks like Conrad Tona would like to talk.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So say we get the sampling all set up and everything's ready to go. I assume, well, I don't assume, say we have a huge turbidity event in the river at the time we fire this dude up. We just pull it when it's high turbidity. It's like 400 gallons is what we're going to be running through this filter, right? Or these filters. So does it matter when we pull the sample? Are we going to have a timeline when to pull the sample? What's the kind of the detail there? Because I'm at the top of the Sacramento River up in Redding. Sometimes we have real high turbidity. Sometimes we have really low turbidity.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the monitoring order will not specify, what time of day or week or anything like that. We'll just specify that one sample per location per quarter be submitted. And so the systems will be able to choose when they want to do that. And that's why the surrogate data will be so useful, because turbidity is one of those surrogates that we're requiring. And so that'll indicate to us if there's an influence with turbidity. It'll also indicate maybe why there could be a bias in the sample. We know that with very high turbid samples, it is more challenging to extract the microplastics. There's more interference, and you're probably not going to get as much water through your sampling device if you have a lot of other particles. It's gonna the back pressure is just going to get too low, too high for you to get the recommended volume through. That's going to be baked into the protocol, though. We're not going to mandate that you break the sampling equipment in order to get certain volume of water through. There'll be some breakpoints. If you can't get it if you can't get more than 700 liters logistically, then that's the end of your sample. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. That data will be associated with the monitoring data that you submit at one point or another.
Okay, but I'm guessing it's probably best to pull it at a lower turbidity event, or do you really care?
I would want a high turbidity and low turbidity event, because if that's your typical range, you're getting that some frequency of high turbidity. I would want to know if that's associated with higher or lower contamination. Get sort of an average spread, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
All right, not seeing any other hands or questions at this time. Anyone else? Looks like the information was so extensive that everyone's questions have been answered. That's great. But folks can email you, right, Scott, if they have additional questions.
Yep, absolutely. Thank
We
you
got a
all for your
couple, yeah.
attention. Thanks to the other panelists for all the great information. Thank you to Molly for running this so smoothly.
Awesome, getting a couple thank yous in the chat. So yeah, we'll make this recording available in the next couple of days, as well as the slides, and I think we'll send it directly to the group. Is that right, Scott? We have to, it'll take a couple of days to get it up on YouTube, so it's shareable. But we'll send it via email. I don't think it'll be posted publicly, right? At least not on the website or anything.
Yeah, it'll be posted on the YouTube, and then we'll send a link out to everyone who registered for the event.
Okay.
Hey, thank you guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Take care.